afternoon to those in Europe and in the Africa region. Good morning to those in the US region, so in the Americas, and good evening to those in the Australia region or in Asia. First of all, I would like to note that this session will be recorded, and after this session has been completed, probably within the coming 2 days, the session will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can re-listen the recording. Also, feel free to put your questions into the chat so that we can ask those questions maybe to our two panelists when we go into the discussion with them. I will be co-hosting this event together with Andrea, who is our Stakeholders Relations Manager at the Ammonia Energy Association. And today's webinar is a little bit different in focus than what we typically do, because typically we see all these announcements regarding techno-economics of renewable ammonia projects, where we focus on locations with the best solar and wind resources and see how that would fit into a levelized cost of your final ammonia project. However, there's also the social aspect. And in today's webinar, we will focus on the social license of low carbon ammonia projects. For this, we have two speakers. First of all, Sam Bartlett from the Green Hydrogen Organization will share with us regarding the green hydrogen certification and what is needed for that from the social license perspective. And then secondly, Jonathan Cocker, who is a lawyer at the Borden Ladner Gervais law firm, he will provide his perspective from the indigenous communities perspective. We will give them a little bit more of an introduction later, but first I would like to go through some recent developments in the ammonia energy scene. So next slide, please, Julian. So one of the developments that we have seen in the recent years, recent months, is that we have seen bigger pilot plants come online. So first, about 10 years ago, we had one of the first pilots for renewable ammonia production in Minnesota, United States, where we had a very small wind turbine hooked up to a very small electrolyzer and an ammonia skid, which was practically at the research scale. And actually last week, another project was signed where Proton Ventures will build a demo plant in Morocco. So 10 years ago, we saw a first demo plant being built at the University of Minnesota facilities in the United States. And now a pilot plant will be built in Morocco, which is a lot bigger than the previous plant. So this really is a step in the right direction. And this new pilot will actually also be able to simulate different renewable electricity profiles. So this can really be a step towards commercialization of large-scale renewable ammonia plants with the knowledge that we can operate such a plant with a reasonable size pilot plant. Next slide, please. So the second thing that's quite interesting is that we saw quite some consortia pop up regarding nuclear-powered ammonia production. So I would like to highlight the Danish consortium of Copenhagen Atomics with Alfa Laval and Topsoe, who are looking into nuclear-powered oxide electrolysis and then coupled that with an ammonia plant, but also a similar consortium between KBR and Terrestrial Energy. And an interesting thing of these consortia is that nuclear power, instead of solar and wind, nuclear power is stable in terms of electricity production. So you don't have the fluctuations, intermittency issue. Therefore, a question that I posed in the title, we don't need an answer for that, but can nuclear power actually be an option to have baseload electricity and basically replace any storage capacity that you need? So, for instance, batteries or compressed hydrogen storage. So that's really a question that pops up right now when looking at nuclear-based ammonia production. Next slide, please. So now let's go back to our topic of today. So today we will talk about the social license for ammonia projects. And our first speaker is Sam Bartlett, who is the director of the Green Hydrogen Standard and CEO of the Roundtable, and he will provide us a perspective regarding social license aspect of green hydrogen and, for that matter, renewable ammonia projects. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin, Trevor, and colleagues at AEA for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I think this is a very timely and fascinating topic, and I'll try to keep my presentation quite short. In preparation for this call, for this webinar, we had an excellent discussion amongst the panelists, and I think it'd be great if we could replicate that again today with more questions from the audience. What I'd like to do is just to quickly introduce myself, and you may not have heard of our organisation because we're relatively new. So my name's Sam Bartlett. I'm the director of the Green Hydrogen Standard at the Green Hydrogen Organisation. And the Green Hydrogen Organisation was launched 9 months ago. And one of our flagship projects is indeed the articulation of a global green hydrogen standard. And one of the key elements of that is the social performance of green hydrogen projects, which is the topic of our webinar today. So next slide, please. Essentially, our standard is addressed to or dedicated to green hydrogen project developers. Green hydrogen projects that meet our standard will be licensed to use the label GH2 green hydrogen, and will be able to trade green hydrogen certificates of origin for hydrogen and derivatives such as ammonia. Our early work with project developers, and there's been quite an extraordinary response to the launch of our standard. I would say the majority of green hydrogen project developers we're working with are actually green ammonia projects. So our coverage of both hydrogen and derivatives like ammonia is absolutely crucial. The second point is that, as Kevin highlighted, a lot of the projects that are in the pipeline, and there are over 100 green hydrogen projects, almost sort of, there's a new one being announced every day. Almost all of them are at a sort of pre-feasibility, or they're not yet at a final investment decision stage. So the work that we're doing on standards and certification is very much targeted on early stage green hydrogen projects, but of course there's a formal certification process for projects that are ready to be constructed and start producing. Next slide, please. Why are standards important? I think that anyone that's spent any time in this field, especially over the last 12 months or 18 months, there's an enormous amount of hype around hydrogen. Some of it is justified. There's a lot of skepticism. One of the challenges is that when people talk about hydrogen and talk about ammonia, often they're talking about very different things, very different production pathways. Green hydrogen producers and customers and end-use consumers, but the producers and consumers or customers need to be able to plan for the long term, need to be able to secure government approvals, financing, offtake agreements, and all of that requires clarity on the commodity and the characteristics of the commodity that we're producing. We also need clear definitions to underpin government policy and the development of enabling environment, particularly the elaboration of incentives and subsidies. And bringing us back to the topic of the workshop today, obviously the focus on the emissions profile is something that gets a lot of attention. I'm not going to talk about grey versus blue versus green hydrogen. We can have plenty of other opportunities to discuss that topic. But also to look at the sustainability standards associated with hydrogen production. And that's going to have a lot of impact on export opportunities and on pricing. And that ultimately, end-use consumers, they want transparency and accountability throughout the supply chain. They want hydrogen and ammonia that has close to zero emissions, but they also want commodities that contribute to sustainable development. And so that's what we're going to dig into some more detail today. Next slide. So our green hydrogen standard has 3 pillars. And the first one I'm not going to dwell on too much. If you've got questions, I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit more. But we've established a definition when it comes to emissions. The green hydrogen requires near 100% renewable energy with close to zero greenhouse gas emissions. We say close to zero because there are some significant emissions associated with green hydrogen production. So we've established a threshold of less than 1 kilo of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen, building on the IPHE methodology that many of you will be familiar with. I'm not going to talk too much about emissions today, but you can, of course, read some more about this in the standard document on our website. If we move on to the next slide, here you have just a quick diagram highlighting. This is essentially a visualization of the IPHE methodology and the system boundary for emissions measurement. So again, happy to discuss that perhaps another day, but let's skip on to the next two elements. The other two pillars of our standard is that while there's a lot of focus on emissions, and that's of course very important, our green hydrogen standard requires that project developers look at the environmental, social, and governance consequences of their projects. And that's something that's required, again, as mentioned, by development banks. If you're looking at financing from commercial banks, it's something that the customers want. So we think this is something that it hasn't received the attention that it deserves. And then you can have a project that has an excellent emissions profile, it has excellent economics, but it doesn't have the support of the host community and of the host government. And so that project will go nowhere, even though that's a sort of world-leading project. One of the issues that's receiving a lot of attention in Europe, and again, I'm not going to go into this in detail today, is the issue of the additionality of renewable energy used to create green hydrogen, also in ammonia production. So we've addressed that in our standard. But the third pillar is looking at the development opportunities, and the impacts of green hydrogen production and green ammonia production need to be fully considered. And you can indeed skip on to the next slide. What we've tried to do here is align our work with international best practice. And when we're working with project developers, really the sort of gold standard in this field is the IFC safeguards framework. So we've drawn, if anyone familiar with the IFC's work on safeguards will see a lot of familiar themes here. So we have a set of requirements that obviously the sort of basics of the project. We have a strong focus on stakeholder engagement, transparency, and accountability, making sure that these projects have gone through a rigorous process of social and environmental impact assessment. Obviously, there are health and safety concerns, and I'm glad that Andrea is on the call today. We should hear more from her. She's written her PhD on the public perception of ammonia projects, and some of the concerns around health and safety are sort of paramount there. And then finally, before joining the kind of hydrogen community, my work was in the extractive industries, and there's some really important lessons to be learned around the transparency and accountability issues here, where the key to winning public confidence and stakeholder trust in projects is a greater focus on transparency and accountability of our operations. So that's something that is also a key feature of our green hydrogen standard. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the outset, our work essentially has sort of two phases: an early stage work where we're doing work now with about a dozen project developers around the world, in Australia, Argentina, China, here in Norway, some projects in Africa as well. These projects are almost all at an early stage, pre-feasibility stage, and we're working with the project developers on a confidential basis before their projects reach final investment decision and before they go through the formal accreditation and certification process. Next slide, please. So as mentioned here, we're doing this essentially a pilot project with about a dozen projects around the world. We're also and one of the reasons that I'm part of this discussion today, is they're also looking at opportunities for harmonizing standards at a global, national and regional level. Around the world, you have government authorities, certification bodies, all looking at developing hydrogen standards and all trying to align their work with international best practice. So there's an enormous amount of activity at the moment. And one of our highest priorities is to try to avoid duplication. There's been an enormous amount of work done on certification that is relevant to our work going forward. As everyone on this call will already be aware, there's already a very large hydrogen industry. There's already a very large ammonia industry. There are well-developed health and safety protocols, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are, of course, new issues related to sustainability, additionality, social license and so forth, and that's where we need to build on the existing body of work and further develop industry standards. We're also, of course, have an eye on sort of the further development of this. This is our first iteration of a global green hydrogen standard, and we expect that standard to evolve over time. Next slide, please. Here I've put just some context for my colleagues working on these issues, but before I hand back, I just wanted to sort of close with an anecdote. I grew up in a remote part of Australia. I now live in quite a remote part of Norway, and I'm actually looking out my window right now. It's a quite extraordinary part of the world. It has some of the best wind resource potential in Europe. It is one of the least densely populated parts of Europe. It has lots of fresh water. It has deep water ports. It has existing infrastructure nearby. So there's an extraordinary potential in this part of the world for green hydrogen and green ammonia production. But if I had to put my finger on one risk, it's related to the social license to operate. And if you talk to my neighbours around this part of the world, you'll find that about 80 or 90% of them are vehemently opposed to further development of wind power and other industrial production in this part of the world. And I think that's quite sobering, because if it's difficult to do here with some of the best renewable potential, with some of the best kind of enabling environment, if we can't get projects off the ground in this part of the world, it's going to be harder everywhere else. And I think the experience that in countries like Norway of getting projects like this off the ground is really one of the key risks that we in the sort of hydrogen and ammonia industry need to tackle head on if we're really going to realize the potential of green hydrogen and green ammonia. So yes, we need to look at emissions. Yes, we need to look at obviously we need to look at the economics and the financial viability of these projects. But if we do not take our social license to operate seriously, then we can have this webinar 10 years from now and we'll still be talking about the potential we're not talking about today. So that's my little rant for the day. I think Jonathan can go into some more detail in his presentation about how some of these issues are being tackled. And I think one of the things that's fascinating, again, here in Northern Norway, is that it's a big part of the opposition to these projects comes from the Indigenous community here. And if we don't get on top of that, if we don't work together with the host communities, these projects won't happen. So really looking forward to the next presentation and discussing with you all how we can lift up this issue of social license to operate and give it the attention it deserves. So thanks for your time and inviting me to join today.
Thank you. Sam, I want to pick up on some of your comments, specifically around social license. And perhaps before I do that, I can thank the association, obviously, for having both of us today. It is a fascinating topic. It's one I think that's near and dear to both of our hearts, having both of us having experience in the extractive industries, I think, and hopefully, relying upon some of that experience and understanding what's coming in terms of social license around ammonia energy and other hydrogen end market projects. So I think it's, there's a lot to be said about social license. And I think I wanted to pick up on what you said around social license being perhaps the most challenging in terms of how these projects are put together. And when we look at other kinds of energy projects, liquid natural gas, obviously mining, other kinds of oil and gas, fracking is one I think what we've seen recently in terms of a real battleground in some parts of the world. What we see consistently is a push from local communities, from local stakeholders to say, what's in it for us? Where is it that we get long-term sustainable development? And what happens when these projects cease operation? So what's the end game? And so when we look at the extractive industries, and mining is one I think where there's been a lot of experience, a checkered past perhaps in terms of the legacy in some parts of the world. But what we've seen there is we've seen some regulation, although maybe not as much historically as local communities would want. We've seen some commitments to the community historically. But what we haven't seen really is we haven't seen a kind of cradle to grave approach in mining until fairly recently. So, in the history of mining, I think they came to this probably first. And so before we were talking about social license as a tag, as a package, the mining industry were some of the first ones to embrace this idea of a plan of commissioning and a plan of decommissioning and a plan along the way. And the reason they came to this was because they needed to in order to continue to develop projects. And so social license really is about, the origins of it are really about the past experience. And the past experience has driven a lot of concerns, again, around what happens when this project is over, what's left, where do we go from there? And so, I think that's interesting in terms of ammonia energy, hydrogen, other kinds of end markets in this space, because we don't have that historical experience yet. We haven't had these projects on the energy side at the scale and the significance that we're now hearing about. And Sam, I hear you. We hear a lot of announcements and maybe not a lot of actual implementation, not a lot of investment final decisions being made yet. But in terms of the aspirations in this space, there's a lot going on, and yet we don't have that prior experience to say what should the content of social license be in this space. I mean, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we don't need to learn the hard way, like we did in mining and like we've done perhaps in some of the oil and gas spaces. But I think it's quite interesting. So without that kind of background, what exactly should the content of social license be? And I'm going to suggest to you that, in fact, there is no single set of parameters that will work consistently in jurisdiction upon jurisdiction. And further, I'm going to suggest to you that there's a lot of other variables, including, of course, the energy sources that will, to some degree, as well as the end markets, the deployments of the energy, that ultimately will color the content, will change the discussion, and ultimately change the content of that social license. Can I have the next slide, please, Julia? So, as we talked about, there's a fair amount of knowledge gap in terms of what to expect on these projects. I mean, a lot of communities are hearing about these things. There's obviously a great deal of interest, but there's a knowledge gap in terms of what will actually happen. How will the energy be brought to bear? How will it be produced? Where will it go? What are the kinds of risks? And I think, Andrea, you'll be able to talk a bit about the health and safety issues, but still, there's a real knowledge gap in terms of what to expect. When we talk about things like ammonia, we sometimes hear discussions around industrial uses of ammonia. And of course, as Sam has said, this is not a new industry. I mean, it's an industry with a very good background, a very established background. It's a large industry worldwide. But when we're talking about ammonia energy, suddenly the debate, there's a bit of a vacuum as to what exactly is the differentiation between ammonia energy versus other kinds of ammonia production. There aren't yet, and I think this is why Sam's input today is so valuable. We don't have clear accepted parameters around what those license terms should be. So how do we know, as a developer, as an investor, how do we know what to expect in terms of those license terms? And again, they can be critical. In fact, they're a true a gating issue for each and every project. And one of the things I think I'm going to suggest to you, and this is going to sound crazy, Sam, but I'll say it to you anyway. I wonder whether having some regulation in this space, because of course in hydrogen and some of the other end markets, we kind of wonder what the regulation will be and where we draw that regulation from, and how it'll fit our industries. But I wonder if some government regulation in this space might be a helpful thing in terms of understanding where the social license takes off, because of course having that floor of regulation at least sets some clarity around where to start. And then from there, we'll see the license build. And of course, as we know, permitting big projects, there tends to be a bit of a mix between what is a true voluntary social license and what is built into some of the other permitting obligations, the plans, the commissioning, the decommissioning we talked about a minute ago. But I wonder whether or not having some of that floor of regulation, hopefully consistent worldwide, is actually a good thing, so that everyone understands where the discussion around pure regulation stops and social license starts. And last but not least, I want to talk about the elephant in the room in my mind, and that is what it is that governments and other stakeholders are saying about hydrogen end markets, including ammonia. I mean, we heard about the hype. I mean, it's incredible sometimes, and sometimes it seems as if this is going to be the panacea for many countries in the world to remake themselves, their position in the marketplace, their energy profile. Next slide, please, Julian. So what exactly are these governments saying? And if you're wondering, if you're going to a particular country and saying, I want to do a project here, and you're wondering, what can I expect from the regulators, from the stakeholders? A good place to start is the actual policies. We've seen, I'm tempted to say it's pushing 40 now, but in the past 2.5 years, a number of countries all over the world have come out with hydrogen strategies. And these strategies are part policy, but they're part industrial ambition. They're part of as I said, a kind of plan to sort of remake themselves. So obviously, in these policies, we'll see issues around emissions and carbon footprints and decarbonization. That's central. We see a transition, an overt transition away from fossil fuels. That's very common worldwide. Commentary around air pollution and other environmental impacts. And energy independence is one that I think is quite interesting. I think the Indian hydrogen mission, if I have that right, is very much focused on energy independence. We've seen that elsewhere in the world. So countries that don't have a domestic oil and gas industry that otherwise have been importing energy are looking at hydrogen and its other end markets, including ammonia, as a potential to remake their own independence on an energy front. And of course, we've seen disruptions in Europe currently that have kind of heightened this debate. So that, of course, is a huge ambition, a very expensive ambition, one that some of us would say sounds great, but ultimately the implementation, the cost, the work that's needed is perhaps somewhat aspirational. And economic growth. I mean, we've seen country after country say hydrogen and its other end markets are central to our economic growth going forward. So, for example, I've thrown in the Canadian hydrogen plan just as one example, but its aspirations, so the federal government aspirations, the ones that will inform how a social license is ultimately constructed, has things such as the hydrogen has to be inclusive, equitable, of course, affordable, reliable, sustainable, etc. right? So, and a lot of the developers out there, of course, are looking at bottom lines. I mean, it's the economics around hydrogen and other kinds of end markets are difficult. They're challenging. They're running very thin on the ground. They're trying to make these projects go. It's a combination of various kinds of incentives as well as some private money that hopefully gets them over the line. The plan, I think, frankly, is that these projects will be more viable in the coming years, but you have to get into the market in order to be relevant going forward. But when you look at these kind of aspirations, that's a heavy tag, quite frankly, on the industry. And I'm going to suggest to you that part of what the governments are saying worldwide, including in Canada, is that you have to do things different than the energy sector has done in the past. You have to do things in a very different way. And that's a tough hurdle, I think, for a lot of companies that are looking to get these projects off the ground and have, frankly, not a lot of fat, not a lot of excess funds to do things other than merely get across that financial line. So, these are going to be challenging. They're going to come back to us and haunt us, I think, in the coming years until we get that kind of playing field that we've just talked about that makes it clear what we're talking about and what we're not in terms of developing these projects. Next slide, please. I had to throw this one in just because I think it's relevant in terms of understanding deployments. So when we talk about hydrogen end markets, does the social license change based on the deployment? And I'm going to suggest to you it absolutely does. And I'm going to suggest to you it also matters what the energy source is. So I think, Kevin, you mentioned a few minutes ago, and I think it's a wonderful segue into our discussion today. You're describing potential uses of nuclear power. So what is the social license for a nuclear-based ammonia energy project? Obviously, it's going to be very different than using existing renewable power from a grid for something like export. They're night and day in terms of what that social license might look like. And on the nuclear side, fortunately or otherwise, we have a real sense of what that social license should be, because of course there have been experiences in the past, and some of them, of course, we're fully aware of, that have really colored what that license needs to be. So, again, getting back to this idea of what the content should be, there's clearly going to be variables on the generation side as well as the deployment side. Next slide, please. So some of the other variables I'd like to talk about are things like whether the project is a greenfield project versus repurposed assets. I think, and from an industrial strategy point of view, we see a lot of governments that are prepared to facilitate the reuse of assets in ways that are not offered to new greenfield projects. And greenfield projects in the ammonia energy space are increasingly going to be focused on, in my mind, offshore wind. And so that'll be an issue that we'll see time and again in various countries in the world as to what the expectations will be around social license in respect of offshore projects. The nature of governmental support, industry support. Sam, you and I talked about this, I think, last week. What's the role for government in these projects? Hopefully there's a limit. Hopefully there's a definition of what that is, and hopefully there's some parameters around it. But the second government is inside these projects in terms of offering support, that this to some degree they're a creature of the regulatory environment that the government is now building based on these policies, plans, and strategies. There's a real sense that a government is a party to these projects, even if they're not necessarily part of the joint venture. And so I think that's something that needs to be looked at from every financer, from every developer, in terms of understanding how this license is going to take shape. Domestic versus export. I think there's a lot of variability around what is acceptable inside a country if the project is for pure export versus for domestic consumption. And of course, the costing is different, right? Local communities will say, we love the idea of hydrogen, ammonia, et cetera, but we don't want to pay extra for it, versus exporting where every country, of course, is bedazzled by the prospects of generation and export into those other jurisdictions. Western Europe is usually commented upon as being the place where great money can be made in terms of exporting hydrogen, ammonia, etc., particularly given the energy crisis. Offshore versus onshore projects, of course, we talked about this. Industrial versus transportation, same thing, right? So if we're dealing with an industrial hub, we have one in my country, in Canada, in the Edmonton area. There's a great deal of support for it. It's not as clear that there will be the same amount of support in the transportation sector, because of course the costing will impact consumers, will impact voters in ways that may or may not be as comfortable. And it also will have a very different footprint in terms of where and how the distribution of ammonia or other kinds of hydrogen end products will be used. What are the auxiliary benefits? I mean, this is something that comes up over and over and over again, questions around what do we get from this? And I think our industry has been trying to define those benefits, but at the same time, navigating what those costs will be, both from a government expenditure point of view, as well as from an end use point of view. And finally, and of course, this is a topic that I think could take the whole session, but proximity to local or indigenous groups. I mean, we're talking about the generation of renewable energy, typically in places like where you are, Sam, where there may or may not be a great deal of other kinds of economic activity, economic opportunities. You have the ability to generate renewable energy at scale to make these projects go. But the question is, what's in it for us? Are you going to build these things? We'll take a very small share of it, perhaps in the context of a benefit agreement, which typically will have some financial incentives, some participation incentives, maybe some training and employment opportunities. But is this, in the long term, is this something that is truly good for our community, given the kind of infrastructure that may be required? And that's a push and a pull, and we've seen that in every extractive industry, and we're going to continue to see it. I'd suggest on the developer side, what we might consider is looking at this as an opportunity to kind of diversify communities, right? So communities that otherwise had maybe focused on certain kinds of industries, fishing, farming, local industries. Maybe there's some mining in the area, but a chance to diversify communities and have opportunities for people, not just in that community, but skills that otherwise can be exported elsewhere. That allows for mobility of young people, I think, is something that's of interest worldwide. Next slide. So last but not least, and we can't have a session on ammonia without talking about Denmark's Power-to-X strategy. So this is a strategy, I think, that serves, again, as an example of what to expect from countries that are focusing on hydrogen end markets. So these are the 4 pillars that found the Denmark strategy. Denmark is all in on Power-to-X, I think. I don't know the country that is more clearly committed to this broad spectrum. Sam, you'll tell me Norway is all in on ammonia. I think that's probably true as well. But specifically, when we look at the strategy, we see it's got to the Power-to-X must contribute to the Danish Climate Act. In other words, it's got to reduce emissions. It's got to be consistent with the broader plan, the NDCs. It's got to place Denmark's strengths in order to operate on market terms in the long run, of course. So that's that financial pressure. It's got to be able to stand up by itself, even though there's all these expectations being heaped upon these projects to do all the things that were never done in the past. There's got to be an integration between the projects and the energy system, of course, and that's a lot of dollars. Improvement of grids is a very big deal worldwide for these projects, and this is the notable one again. They must be able to export the products and technologies. So notice that it's technologies as well. In other words, incubate these kinds of projects, learn on the technology side, and then export them. So that, I think, informs, again, what the mindset is of some regulators. They see this as an ability not just to improve the environmental performance, the social performance inside their own country, but also an ability to sell what they're doing worldwide. And that, that again is aspirational. And of course, they're not alone in that. So I think, we'll see more and more countries trying to pile on, get into this place and see what they can do. And very soon we'll see maybe a saturation, Sam, in terms of these markets around who's doing what and who's going to sell their technologies and their know-how. And maybe we're not going to see as many buyers once these price tags start to be borne by local communities. So with that, Julian, back to you.
Thank you, Jonathan and Sam, for this interesting presentation. You know that I personally find this topic fascinating. As Sam was mentioning, I have my PhD on public perception of green ammonia. So the work of standards and advising to work with indigenous communities, I think is essential, not only for hydrogen and ammonia projects, but for any energy project. And maybe with this idea, we can start like a discussion panel. I have a question for you, Jonathan. So 5 years ago, while I was doing my research, I came across with an article from The Guardian, and this number has always been on my mind. And it was this quoting this study in the UK that was saying that 6 out of 10 projects for onshore wind farms were rejected because of public opposition. And personally, I find that sometimes industry people don't realize the high impact of public in this kind of projects. And 6 out of 10, I think, is a lot. And of course, this was 5 years ago, but I wanted to ask you, how do you see these in general for renewable energy projects, the acceptance in communities in Canada with your experience, if it's similar?
Yeah, and look, I think, we've come a long way, and many countries have worldwide, right? They've come a long way in terms of gaining public acceptance for renewable energy projects. I mean, there was certainly a time when it was not uncommon to see challenges based on assertions that there were adverse health impacts to individuals who otherwise were somewhat proximate to some of these installations. And those kind of assertions, I think, have come and gone to some degree. I think there wasn't a nexus, an evidentiary basis to establish those. So instead, I think what we're seeing is, countries being very much prepared, including Canada, being very much prepared to host these projects, but looking at the social license issues around these as being very much central to their development. In fact, so the strategy, I think the proper strategy for a developer in any of these kind of projects is to engage local communities right away, before anything is formalized, before there's announcements, before the government has come out and cut a ribbon on anything. Engage communities first, get a relationship, get an alliance in terms of understanding how this is going to work before, and then make sure that those communities, including indigenous communities, are front and center, along with the developers, along with the other stakeholders, once these things are public. And if that's not done, and I think, Sam, you were alluding to this earlier, if that's not done, many of these projects will die. And in fact, we've seen that in a number of different energy verticals, and I suspect that will continue to happen here. And I think maybe there's a maturation, Andrea, there's a maturation point really for this industry, right? So instead of being an industry that didn't necessarily have a great deal of focus on it, public focus on it, once you're in this new industry, once you're part of decarbonization worldwide, things switch. And so suddenly people will focus upon you in ways they previously didn't. So I think that's part of the learning curve that developers in the ammonia space, for example, are going to have to learn.
Absolutely. And Sam, in terms of standards, I see that, we met when the green hydrogen standard was launched in Barcelona, how ammonia projects fit into the standard. That would be my question.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, again, when we look at the portfolio globally of green hydrogen projects, they're growing every day. I think it's fair to say the majority of them, particularly from a volume perspective, are actually green ammonia projects. So they have to go hand in hand. And I wanted to come back to something that sort of Jonathan mentioned. I think there are some really important lessons to be learned from the oil and gas and the mining industry, the sort of upstream extraction. But if you find an oil field off the shore of Norway or off the shore of Guyana or off the shore of Mauritania, everyone says, right, we're going to be rich, you know. That isn't going to happen with our industry. These are not super profitable projects. So the questions turn to issues like, okay, well, what will be the impact on the infrastructure in terms of port infrastructure and things like that? What is the impact on water? And I saw there was a question from one of the participants about that. Again, up here in northern Norway, we have lots of fresh water. That's less of an issue, but it's still an important one. If you're in a water-stressed environment like Mauritania or Namibia, that's a big issue. And a third issue is, what is the impact it's going to have on the power market? If you have an energy consumer, that's going to have an impact on the prices for others as well. And we're seeing that at the moment. There's enormous social pressure around inflation and energy costs. So even around these issues around additionality, additionality is a really interesting issue. But just the basic impact that our growing industry could have on energy costs is something that we all need to sort of take very seriously. If we don't manage it well, then there's going to be a backlash saying we don't want this industry because it's going to drive up power prices for everybody else. So, I think the green hydrogen and the green ammonia work go hand in hand. Essentially, we need to have. I like to sort of think of our work also as essentially as a data standard, because I think some of the early work that's been done in this field was talking about local applications where you use electricity to produce hydrogen, produce ammonia, and then use it locally. And of course, that will happen. But what we're going to see is the emergence of a very sophisticated and complex global supply chain, where you'll have electricity production upstream, hydrogen, ammonia production, transportation, shipping, then potentially cracking the ammonia back again into hydrogen so that it goes into pipelines. And no one entity will have responsibility for that. You're going to have different companies at different parts of the value chain. And so we'll need to develop essentially a language, again, building on the existing hydrogen and ammonia industry standards, where we can essentially talk about sustainability and emissions issues, and that different entities and different part of that supply chain can then pass on that information. Because we may start with renewable electricity in Namibia that becomes green hydrogen, that becomes green ammonia, that then gets shipped to Europe and then gets turned into green steel, that gets turned into a green vehicle. And you'll have a dozen companies involved in that supply chain. So yes, there'll be local production and utilization, but we need a way as an industry, we need data standards so this information isn't lost along the way, so that ultimately the customer and the consumer knows what they're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like to say that we should start looking more at communities instead of an obstacle, as an enablers to be able to develop all these kind of technologies, right?
Jonathan, you wanted to follow up on this?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention on the certification and standards. I mean, and this is maybe just a plug for the AEA, but we're working on this as well. And I think looking at integrating standards on the ammonia energy side, particularly on the green ammonia energy side, with hydrogen is something that I think we're very much focused on, because I think Sam's absolutely right. We need to have an international marketplace where we have certainty around origins, certainty around emissions profile. And so the end user, when you go and purchase your steel, you know that it is green steel, and there's a provenance there that you can actually follow. So I think that's something we're very much working on, and that is really part of the heavy lifting, I think, that we're all trying to do to make these markets really work.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And another point in your presentation I wanted to point out and ask Sam regarding, and that is the issue of nuclear power. So we got a question from the audience regarding whether nuclear power will be included in such a green hydrogen standard, such that we don't get like all these competing different standards, like a green hydrogen standard for renewables, such as solar and wind, and then a pink hydrogen standard for nuclear power. How can we make sure that this is all inclusive and the word green is not so much a denominator of the electricity source, but more a proper way to also include other SDGs? So Sam, can you comment on that?
I can give you the short answer and a slightly longer answer. The short answer is that we don't cover it. And the reason that we don't cover it is that there's obviously a set of issues around the social and environmental impact of nuclear power that are specific to that sector and are very controversial. There are just across the border here in Finland, there's expansion of nuclear industry. There are plans for production of hydrogen and ammonia. That's socially accepted. I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire Finnish population, but that's the decision that's been made there to move ahead. Whereas in other jurisdictions, they're moving away from nuclear power. So we recognise that that's a sort of important part of the industry. What we've chosen to do is we've taken a very pragmatic decision. If you take the 100 largest green hydrogen projects, that it's solar, wind, and hydropower that account for 95% of it. And the lead times in developing new nuclear capacity are very long. 7 years at best, more likely 10, 12 years. So, when it comes to rapidly scaling up this industry, we see solar, wind, and hydropower as accounting for the majority of the production that's going to come online. So we're focusing on that. Now, we're of course open to collaborating with people that are working on other projects. If we start talking about the development of data standards, then of course we want to harmonize that with what other people are doing. But if we tried to cover everything, there are also biomass projects, waste to energy projects. It's a very complex field. If we tried to do everything, then we wouldn't be able to agree on a standard in the next 3 years because we'd be arguing with each other forever. So we've purposefully focused on the technologies that are the leading candidates for scaling up the industry, and we have an open door to collaborating with other people.
Yeah, that's indeed very good to hear. So what I sense from your answer is right now the main focus is on solar and wind and maybe hydropower. But if it turns out that, for instance, new nuclear power sources are meeting your standards, that can be included in the standard, similar to biomass or, for instance, biogas.
Sure, and I just mentioned that we're obviously working very closely with the solar, wind, and hydropower associations. I mean, one of the things about the additionality requirement in Europe is that it sort of incentivizes new hydropower. And hydropower comes with very significant social and environmental impacts. So we've been working very closely with the International Hydropower Association. How can we align green hydrogen standards with best practice in the hydropower sector? And I think a big part of this is, and this is part of what Jonathan was saying, is that, this is not about reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of good work and a lot of best practices that this industry can build on, and we can avoid some of the mistakes. It's often, the mining sector and the oil and gas sector, they often talk about the resource curse. Let's avoid a resource curse 2.0 in the hydrogen and ammonia sector. Yeah. We can do that by some very sort of basic lessons, and that's what we've tried to incorporate into our standard.
Jonathan, you want to comment on that regarding any projects with hydropower, for instance, in the local community?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Sam's absolutely right. I mean, the social license around hydropower, new hydropower, is going to be very different than wind or solar. And so, you know, understanding what that looks like, and obviously each country will have its own dynamic. But I mean, that's going to be very much relevant to you know, new development, new capacity, and hydropower. Without nuclear, hydropower is definitely a significant driver in terms of the energy resource needed to make hydrogen and markets work. I mean, it's very significant. In my own country, we have producers such as Hydro-Quebec who have been very much focused on both domestic and export markets, and have been very active in this space, including on the ammonia energy side. And they're able to do so because they have a surplus of low carbon energy, right? They have more than they need. They've been exporting to the United States for many years, and they look at these new markets as an opportunity to otherwise create domestic production for export purposes as well as for domestic purposes. And so, for them, that, you know, they've already got the social license for their existing capacity. Hard fought, controversial, no doubt, but those days are behind them. So now it's really about how do you give back to the communities that otherwise have been relevant to this generation and make sure that they participate going forward. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things we should be looking at is, you know, the focus on diversification of opportunities within communities that are impacted, because I think that is critical. Too much, we talk about a resource curse, a single resource curse, I think, Sam, is really what people talk about, right? So, you know, a one-trick pony, for whatever reason, it no longer becomes viable, and then there's nothing left. I think this is an opportunity for diversification within communities that otherwise have not had that opportunity previously. I think that's a central message to social licensing.
Yeah, totally. I'm just going to, one other thing, and it's just because the question came up in the chat about water, and just it's important to avoid, you know, quick fixes. So let's take the water issue, for example. We've had a couple of project developers say to us, yes, we're doing a project in a water-stressed environment. We're going to develop a desalination plant. We're going to overbuild that, and then we're going to make water available to the local community. Now that sounds really appealing until you think a little bit further about, well, who will get access to that water and on what terms? Because that creates all kinds of risks around rent seeking and, you know, so it sounds like, you know, intuitively, yep, that's a perfect solution. It's technically viable, it's financially viable. But if you don't get the governance of that right and you don't consult with the community, you could be doubling down on your problems rather than solving them. So, and it's the same with giving away free power. Who will get that free power? What will they use it for? So these are not problems that are insurmountable, but you know, there's no quick fix. And I think one of the things that Jonathan, you expected me to object to, but I completely agree with. It comes down to local circumstances, local culture, local environment, and working through those risks and opportunities. We can work on some global standards, but there has to be flexibility to accommodate those local circumstances. Yeah. So that's, and, you know, ultimately, these are, you know, resources to be, you know, for each country to decide, you know, what their pathway is. And it's for, you know, the democratic process in each of those countries to be followed. So we have to respect that. So we need global standards that have flexibility to accommodate local conditions. And that's a paradox, but that's the paradox that we'll have to tackle over the coming decade if we're going to scale up.
Yeah. And I think, Sam, the mistake in the past is to say, you know, one size fits all. Let's have a single standard, because of course that gives greater certainty in the marketplace, but that certainty in the marketplace is meaningless if it doesn't work on the ground. And that's where social license comes back to bite developers who think that they can do the same thing in Western Europe that they're purporting to do in South America or Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, it just doesn't work.
spot on.
You're totally right, and we've been talking for an hour now. We have had a very lively discussion, and a few key takeaways from the last comments are: you need to look at the local circumstances. You need to be flexible. You need to diversify for the local communities, and it also very much goes for the ammonia energy transition. So you need a diversification of the toolbox. So you might need carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, but also renewable resources. So for instance, solar PV, wind, hydropower. You might also need nuclear. So I'm very, very glad for the fruitful discussion we've had. And before closing off, I would really like to mention that next month we have another webinar regarding renewable fertilizers in Europe, where we'll go into discussion with Brigitte Holter from Yara and with Theo Paquet from Fertilizers Europe. But for now, I really want to thank both you, Sam and Jonathan, for the very fruitful discussion you had with me and Andrea. And I would also like to thank the audience for sticking with us for the entire hour, and see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.